Welcome to the latest instalment of Close Readings. In this series, we are considering a sequence of poems that could be thought of as, in one way or another, political, in their purpose, or in their impact, or in their circumstances. My name is Seamus Perry, and I teach English at Balliol College in Oxford, and I'm talking, as always, to Mark Ford, poet, critic, and Professor of English at University College London. And today's poem is Louis MacNeice's great, hugely circumstantial poem of 1938, Autumn Journal. Often, Mark, these days, considered MacNeice's best single work.
I think it is. I think all his virtues come together in it. It's got both a kind of rigour in terms of it's rhymed throughout, so it demonstrates his ability to write a really beautifully kind of structured poem that makes use of English prosody in a really exciting and innovative way. But it's also got this astonishing documentary vividness. I think that's a phrase from Ian Hamilton's review of a book on MacNeice in the LRB, so that it captures exactly for a certain class of person, the zeitgeist of August 1938 to December 1938, a period of absolute crisis, the kind of fall of Czechoslovakia and so on. And it registers these climactic, catastrophic events with a kind of honesty. And the 30s poets all prided themselves on their honesty, didn't they? And in his account of the poem, which he gave in a sort of preface, he talks about its honesty. So he's writing it up to the minute. It's a diary-style poem. I can't think of any kind of something similarly diaristic, apart perhaps from Arthur Hugh Clough's Amour de Voyage, which witnesses revolutionary events in Italy in 1849 with a similar up-to-the-moment feel to it. But MacNeice is living it and experiencing it through the radio often. There's lots of references to the radio,
Yeah.
The box, which is squawking away and with bad news on it. So in many ways, it captures the ideals of 30s poetry, which were to be relevant, topical, journalistic, responsive to events, but also honest in terms of the persona of the poet presenting them. So that the poet, as ordinary bloke, is a phrase from Samuel Hines's review.
Yes.
And MacNeice is not exactly an ordinary bloke. He went to kind of Sherborne, Marlborough,
Yes,
Merton College, Oxford.
Happy to talk about Hegel and Plato and so on. I mean, he's quite a highbrow, ordinary bloke. But anyway, I take the point.
But I think it does register events like, say, the gun emplacements on Primrose Hill. You know, he watches that happen.
Yeah.
And that is the way in which he registers the approach of war.
Yes, absolutely. And he writes himself, doesn't he, about his desire elsewhere for what he writes about what he calls impure poetry. That's what he likes. He likes poetry that is conditioned by the poet's life and the world around him, he says. And I suppose you can see this poem as absolutely the exemplification of those ambitions, really. When he praises Auden, who he likes, and we might come back maybe to the way in which this is a poem that is influenced by the example of Auden, but is consciously doing something a bit different from Auden. But he does like Auden for being what he calls a journalist poet. I do not mean journalistic, he says, a journalist poet. And that brings together several things, doesn't it? The journal structure of the piece being a little bit like a kind of implicit diary, but also journalist in the sense of reportage, as you say, kind of making notes on what's happening in the condition of England at this moment of crisis, this autumnal moment where England is slipping away into an unknowable winter.
Yeah, terrifying, absolute terrifying moment. I mean, they had just got back from Iceland, hadn't they? They went to Iceland together in 1936. And I think the difference in a way between them is that whereas Auden tends to present himself as a bit of an authority on things, in MacNeice, you've got both the kind of panoramic survey of England, particularly you get in the opening section of it. He's getting the train from Hampshire up to London, and you get this brilliant account using the train journey as a way of capturing the spirit of England at this particular moment.
Shall we have those lines, just so we've got the voice of the poem in our minds?
But I just wanted to say that the panorama goes along with the subjectivity, which is probably more naked than you get in Auden, that he's revealing things about himself, his failed love affair with Nancy Coldstream, just so that you get this oscillation between a large-scale analysis or diagnosis of England, which is the kind of thing you get in Auden.
Night Mail or something.
Yes, but along with that, you get this kind of rather kind of often heartfelt and brutally honest revelation about what kind of bad feelings he's having at the end of a love affair.
Yes, there's lots of self-ironising and a lot of self-deprecation going on, isn't there, in the MacNeice persona, which is one of the most attractive things about it.
Yeah, and the irony and the wit and the kind of the brilliance. Yeah, let's have a look at the opening.
Close and slow, summer is ending in Hampshire, ebbing away down ramps of shaven lawn, where close-clipped yew insulates the lives of retired generals and admirals, and the spyglasses hung in the hall, and the prayer books ready in the pew, and August going out to the tin trumpets of nasturtiums, and the sunflower's Salvation Army blare of brass, and the spinster sitting in a deck chair picking up stitches, not raising her eyes to the noise of the plains that pass northward from Leon Solent. So I always think it's very striking, though I'm sure coincidental, that he's at the same school and as a contemporary with Betjeman, because there's a lot of Betjemanian kind of elegiac Englishness about lines like this. But I don't think Betjeman would have put in the detail of the aeroplanes going overhead at the end as a kind of omen of military war.
There would be something
campaign.
a bit more cheeky and impish in a Betjeman poem about the state of things. I think that's right. And I think the 30s poets can be seen in the kind of, long view as post-imperial poets, and the ways in which this opening is hymning or showing the obsolescence of a kind of almost an Edwardian style of living, that this is the old style, that these majors, the Salvation Army and so on, and the spinster, all belong to an atrophied, dying imperial vision of England.
Edwardian England, isn't it? Sepia Edwardian England, as it were, which is subject at once to MacNeice's irony and even, I suppose, to a degree satire, but also a tremendous amount of affection. He's got a much more indulgent attitude towards the English past, I think, than some of his more ideologically committed contemporaries have.
Yes, and he's able to oscillate from one to the other. He often sees that the passing of this era as necessary, that this is kind of modernity is replacing the spinster sitting in a deck chair picking up stitches, and the ominousness of the planes, which are obviously military planes. And the whole of this first section becomes almost like Auden's Night Mail, a way of kind of charting this country of ours where no one is well,
yes,
to use an Auden phrase. And we mustn't mention Auden again, I think, because MacNeice has suffered from being in Auden's shadow, but is a completely different sort of poet in all sorts of ways. And while they share certain kind of ambitions, his own idiom is completely his own.
So let's just fill in some of the backstory. MacNeice, we happen to know, was in Hampshire, staying with his father, who was a bishop in the Church of Ireland, and his stepmother and his aunt, and he's just left. And so this train journey that he's describing is leaving the part of Hampshire that's closest to Portsmouth, so a great military base, and it's moving towards London, which we get to. And the rest of the poem then occupies a kind of series of exemplary English spaces between London and Birmingham. And then we have one section which glimpses at an Irish past. And then interspersed amongst those, in this really kind of fascinating journal come topographical way, we have two visions of Spain. So it's very much a place that's a poem that's dominated by ideas of place and different thoughts about place, but also about, as you were saying earlier on, about personal affairs, also about politics. There's quite a lot about philosophy. I mean, it's quite a difficult poem to pigeonhole, isn't it?
Yes, and it presents a kind of existential crisis in some ways, and that one of the things of the 30s was, what are you going to do about it? Which side are you on? And MacNeice is never far away from anxieties about what he should be doing. He's teaching classics. He's a lecturer in classics at kind of Birmingham and Bedford College in London, and that doesn't seem particularly relevant in some ways, though he brings in the classics quite often to understanding the moment. But there is this attempt to interpret history, politics, in an honest way, in relation to what he can do about it as a person. And he does take personal action politically. For instance, he goes to Oxford during the by-election and he ferries voters to the booths. so that he's not apolitical. He takes explicit political action. And the last section has him going to Spain in December 1938 to Barcelona, which was right in the middle of the Spanish Civil War. So MacNeice is not at all in an ivory tower. I think this is one of the concepts of the poet that he wants to reconfigure, that the poet is somewhere out there experiencing things, being honest about them, but also obliged to take existential decisions and political decisions like everybody else. So this, in a way, I suppose, politically, this poem becomes a way to survive, or charts a way of surviving, or an honest way of describing his experiences of existential, political, historical crisis in a way that sort of makes sense of them, but doesn't overinterpret them and is not neither too pessimistic nor too utopian.
Yes, I think one of the things I most like about it is the way that it takes the possibility of political commitment seriously, while at the same time taking equally seriously his own inability to become committed. So he's able to write very polemical lines describing modern England, an utterly lost and daft system that gives a few at fancy prices their fancy lives, while 99 in 100 who never attend the banquet must wash the grease of ages off the knives, which is the sort of thing you might have got in a kind of agitprop drama of the 1930s. But then a few lines later, a different MacNeice voice kicks in. It is so hard to imagine a world where the many would have their chance without a fall in the standard of intellectual living, and nothing left that the highbrow cared about. Which fears must be suppressed. It's very good, isn't it?
Yes, and he makes use of this term laissez-faire quite often throughout the poem, doesn't he? Laissez-faire is kind of shorthand for capitalism, I suppose. And laissez-faire is doomed. As many people in the 30s thought laissez-faire capitalism was doomed. You were either communist or fascist, but capitalism itself was at the end of the line. And he is, in that passage you quoted, remorseless in his depiction of the inequalities of laissez-faire capitalism, and presents himself appalled by them, but also, obviously, as all of us are, helpless in the face of them, that how are you going to overturn that particular system? But the diagnosis that he offers is ruthless, isn't it?
Thanks for listening to this extract from Political Poems, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. You can listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series by signing up to our close reading subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast, or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.